Hello everybody, my name's Saul Faust and I'm the Director of the NIHR Southampton Clinical Research Facility and Clinical Director of Wessex NIHR Clinical Research Network. And I'm going to talk today about the COVID-19 vaccines. We're all used to seeing the coronavirus on the news and in the newspapers, a virus with spike protein on the outside, and it gets into the body and causes coronavirus infection. Our immune system tries to eliminate the coronavirus by a complicated mechanism that uses antibody and the cells, the T and B cells, to produce the antibody itself, but also to give us long-lived memory immunity. And what we're trying to do with vaccines is both make antibody against the coronavirus and stimulate the body to have memory so that we can be protected from coronavirus for some time. So for any new vaccine, we need to know if it's safe. Does it make an immune response? Does it protect against infection? And if it does, how long does that protection last? For coronavirus, we also need to know if there's a risk of something called enhanced disease. And this is a phenomenon we saw with respiratory syncytial virus infections, so bronchiolitis infections, in babies in the 1970s, when a vaccine against RSV was given to children, and actually some of them were found to have a worse disease when they met RSV than children not vaccinated. Now, for coronaviruses, this phenomenon was also seen in animals with coronavirus vaccines tested after the SARS outbreak about 10 years ago. And so it's very important, although there were no humans in the SARS vaccines at the time, and there were no human trials of the SARS vaccines at the time, it's really important that we check in the coronavirus vaccines now that there's no risk of enhanced disease. And we haven't yet seen any in any of the vaccine trials done so far. We also need to know about whether any boosters are needed, how long the immunity might last, or and how often we might need a booster. Do we need coronavirus vaccine every year, like flu, or will it last a few years? And we need to know if if the vaccines are going to be better used together, one after the other, in combination, rather than 2 doses of the same vaccine. And we call that heterologous prime boost. And those are studies we'll need to do once we have more than one vaccine with approval to use. So in the UK, the Vaccine Task Force has secured what they call 4 buckets of vaccines. So that means they've got 4 different types of technology with a couple of vaccines in some of those categories. So of the recombinant spike protein-based vaccines, these are vaccines that are conventional vaccine technology with a protein stuck to another molecule that stimulates the immune system. And an example of this was the Novavax vaccine. This has been recruited to a study with 15,000 people in the UK. And that's the largest vaccine study ever done in the United Kingdom. In future, the GSK Sanofi vaccine, if it comes through for trial, is also this type of vaccine. The inactivated vaccine is a French company, but manufactured in the UK. This is where coronavirus is taken and whole coronavirus is deactivated and made into a vaccine directly. That will come through phase 1, very early trials, starting in Bristol in December, and then in Southampton and other places around the country in January and February for the phase 1, and then larger scale trials. The replication incompetent vector vaccines are the Oxford vaccine and the Janssen vaccine. Now, the Oxford vaccine is a chimpanzee cold virus vaccine, and the Janssen vaccine is a human cold virus vaccine. The adenovirus, the cold virus, can't replicate in the body. It can't give us a cold or infection, but what it does is it produces the spike protein on the outside, and what we call presents that spike protein to the immune system when it's given as a vaccine to generate the immune response. A new category of vaccines, the RNA vaccines, and the examples here are Pfizer and Moderna, and the Imperial vaccine in due course. The RNA vaccines use a piece of RNA, which is message, and we'll come back to that in a minute, coated in a lipid nanoparticle, which allows it to be delivered to the muscle in an injection in a vaccine without causing more than the normal side effects that vaccines cause. And that we'll talk about RNA vaccines more in a minute. The Pfizer and Moderna vaccines don't replicate in the body. They're a single piece of RNA that doesn't replicate itself. The Imperial vaccine is a self-replicating RNA that might come to a larger trial later on next year, or at the beginning and into next year. The phase 1 study is still going on, including here in Southampton. So for this new vaccine class, the RNA vaccines, how can we be sure they're safe? They've been investigated for some time now for things like anti-cancer vaccines. And in the past, they've been associated with some more immediate side effects, so swelling and pain, that were maybe a bit more than other classes of vaccine. But we've now got these 2 trials from Pfizer and Moderna, and we're going to talk a bit later on, we've deployed the Pfizer vaccine. Well, how do we know they're safe? Well, at any single moment, a human cell has over 5,000 different RNA messages, and they're all temporary. If you're old like me, then imagine like a Post-it note that gets torn up by the cells within minutes or hours after being read, or our kids know Snapchat messages that expire. So it's there, it's message, and then it disappears. It doesn't, and it cannot become a permanent part of our body. We don't have the enzymes in our body to turn it back into DNA. It's impossible. So these are temporary messages instructing cells to make one viral protein, just temporarily, i.e., the non-replicating RNA message is just for one single coronavirus protein, and it takes over 25 different coronavirus proteins to make a coronavirus. So there's absolutely no chance about the vaccine RNA making a virus. And now over 70,000 doses of the RNA vaccines have been given to people in clinical trials, and the independent safety boards that aren't controlled by the companies have reported no serious concerns. And the regulators, the FDA in America, the EMA in Europe, and the MHRA in England, the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Authority, review all the immunogenicity and safety data, all the clinical trial data independently, before providing approval for clinical use. They're looking at the data. They're not looking at the company's interpretations of that data. And the MHRA are global leaders in approving medicines and vaccines for human use. They would not approve a vaccine that they didn't feel was safe in the population that they've approved it for. They've been doing a rolling review of the data. So that means they've been, the companies and the Oxford team have been submitting them data as they've gone along. And this has been, the trials have been able to be done quickly because the research world hasn't been doing anything else. We've been focused on coronavirus vaccines and other medicines and therapeutics, but the regulator have put this as top priority. So over the normal 10 years that we develop a vaccine, actually we've enrolled way more people in the phase 3 studies than would normally be in phase 3 studies for new vaccines, and none of the regulatory processes have been cut short or been or any corners cut. Everything that is normally done has been done, apart from letting the studies run to completion and having the full data set over the year or 2 years of the trials. But everything else has been done just the same as normal. And of course, being safe doesn't mean the vaccine doesn't hurt or that we won't get a fever, because these vaccines are all designed to mimic, to create an immune reaction in the body. So the Vaccine Task Force in the UK has developed a pipeline of vaccine trials, and the model has been that the UK government will provide support for the vaccine trials, and then the companies use that money to do contract commercial research in the UK, and that's how we've been able to sort of business plan, if you like, the large-scale vaccine trials that are happening. And the money that the government have put into those trials will get knocked off the bill for the vaccines if they're approved for use in due course. So we know that there'll be 100 million doses of AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine available if the vaccine receives conditional approval, 60 million of Novavax, and so on. And 40 million doses of Pfizer will come through, starting already, as started this week. And the cold chain supply, Pfizer are global experts in that supply. They have been able to move vaccine around the world at any temperature, including very cold temperatures, for some time. The Moderna vaccine that Moderna is a new company that have to sort out their logistical pipelines and supply chains. And so we're not expecting that vaccine to get to the UK before late March, April, perhaps next year. So, as I've explained, the Vaccine Task Force has a National Institute for Health approach was to deliver these large-scale vaccine trials in the UK across all our regions, 15 in England and Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And in Wessex, we've operated as a region with all our hospitals coming together with the NHS, the Sustainable Transformation Partnership, or ICS, the Integrated Care System for Hampshire and Dorset, have both given us coordination and project management support and physical location and logistics support, and helping us with staff to be able to deliver these large-scale vaccine trials, both for Hampshire and for Dorset. And they're quite complicated trials. We've had to have 24 hours on call for people to be able to phone up, and the ability to review and test symptomatic individuals, because whether or not people get coronavirus is the endpoints for the study. So if people get symptoms, they have to come and be tested and have blood tests and so on. And for the Oxford study, which many of you in Southampton are part of, we've also been actively monitoring everybody for infection. That's a swab every week that's gone to the National Nightingale labs. And that means that for the Oxford trial, we're also going to get information on whether the vaccine stops asymptomatic carriage or not just whether it stops individuals getting infection. And I've explained this system-wide approach across Hampshire and Dorset, and we've recruited now 591 participants to the Novavax trial in Bournemouth, and now over 850 participants in 4 trials so far in Southampton, in the research facility, in the sports hall at the university, and now at the new vaccine and research hub at the Royal Hospital that opened on the 12th of November. And the Janssen study is the one we're recruiting to in Southampton at the moment, though we've stopped recruiting healthcare workers because we will all receive deployed vaccines soon. But for the people who haven't yet received vaccine, the people not on the priority list, the people under 50, we're still able to carry on recruiting to the vaccine trials that need to be done, because it will probably be not till late April, maybe May, June, July, before the under 50s in the UK get deployed vaccine if they're not in one of the priority groups. So what do we know about the vaccines? So the Pfizer vaccine's been deployed this week, and we know from the press release and from the data that the MHRA have made available that it's said to be about 95% effective against COVID-19. This is the most effective it's going to be, because this data is from starting a month after the second dose for a couple of months, or 2 or 3 months, until the data was submitted to the regulators for approval. So the antibody levels will be at their very highest, and it might well be that the antibody levels wane over a period of time. So over the whole year or 2 of the study, that number might drop over, say, a whole year. But still, it was a fantastic result and really exciting for all vaccine researchers and the public globally, because this was the first time we even had any inkling that we could make a vaccine against a coronavirus. And the fact that all the vaccines are aimed at the spike protein meant we were really hopeful that many of the vaccine technologies would be effective against COVID-19. And there was really good safety data, no major side effects identified. Side effects very similar to every other vaccine that we use in the population. About nearly 4% feeling tired and 2% having a headache, others having arm pain and so on. And Pfizer expect to be able to produce globally up to 50 million doses this year and up to 1.3 billion doses by the end of next year. And as we know, the MHRA have granted a temporary authorization, temporary because the study hasn't finished yet and all the data hasn't been finished yet, but this is for a pandemic, and they've allowed the vaccine to be deployed conditionally in the population. Moderna have also announced that their vaccine is 4% effective against severe COVID-19 and with a similar side effect profile as the Pfizer vaccine, and submitted for approval to the European MHRA and US regulatory authorities, as we've discussed. Notice for both Pfizer and Moderna, this is against severe infection. So that 95% is people who've got genuine COVID-19 symptoms. Now, the Oxford vaccine has been reported, and the paper was published this week in The Lancet, and you can read that. It's an open access paper. An overall efficacy of 70.4%. Now, we know, because we've been doing the study in Southampton, that we can't directly compare at this stage that 70% with the Pfizer and Moderna amounts, because the WHO threshold for a vaccine was 50%. So we would have been very happy with 70% before the Pfizer and Moderna figures were announced. But we're actually really happy with 70% or 70.4% for this vaccine. And that's for a number of different reasons. The first is that we were testing people for COVID who didn't necessarily have a whole fever, cough, and the gamut of symptoms. You didn't have to have very many symptoms and tell us about it. And we brought people in for a swab and blood test. So it might be that and we don't know this yet, it's just not out there and isn't there to compare. It might be that by comparing the 95%, the 94% and 70% are comparing apples and oranges. Or it might be that we're comparing exactly the same thing. We don't know yet. That will become clear when more information's in the public domain. But we would be very happy with 70% for a pandemic vaccine, which isn't far off what we normally see in flu. But in fact, what the Oxford study has reported was two different rates of efficacy. One at 90% in a group given low dose and then high dose for the booster, and one group given and one group reported at 62%, which was the two high dose groups for the prime dose and then the booster dose. Now, this has been reported, unfortunately, by the media. It wasn't a mistake. It was something that happened and the regulator knew about because of the way the vaccine production was being scaled up from one factory in Italy to other plants around the world, and AstraZeneca came on board. And the way they counted the viral particles was different between the periods of the trial. And a decision was made to based on what was known at that time, to go with what became the high dose group, but to offer the people who'd had a lower dose a dose at a higher dose. And the information sheet, we as researchers explain that to the participants in the low dose, high dose group, but also we know from other vaccines that have been tested before, not coronavirus vaccines, that sometimes when you go too high on the dose, the immune response gets worse. So people had to make decisions, and the MHRA was consulted about which doses to use, and the decision was to go with low dose, high dose, but then high dose for the bulk of the study. And it turns out that actually the protection against COVID appears to be better in the low dose than high dose group. Now, at this point in time, we don't know whether the MHRA, if they were to conditionally approve this vaccine, will recommend a high dose because of the more people who are in the safety cohort, or whether actually because the other one is lower dose than high dose, they will recommend a low dose, high dose because they can see that efficacy data is higher. What they will have that we don't know yet, that's not in the public domain, is information about the neutralizing antibody in those two groups. So not in the current paper and not yet available even to us as investigators, are the levels of the neutralizing antibody generated in those two cohorts. And it might be, if there's biological plausibility for the low dose, high dose being better than the high dose group, it might be that the regulator approved for conditional use the low dose, high dose group. We don't know. We'll just have to wait and see. Of course, that would be beneficial globally because you could get a lot more people immunized out of the same amount of vaccine manufactured. And the other thing about this vaccine is that it's being manufactured at cost, not at profit. And AstraZeneca and the University of Oxford have been very clear about that for a global market, not just for the UK. So the other thing that this vaccine might do is the data so far do suggest that it might be able to reduce virus transmission in asymptomatic individuals. And the other studies The Pfizer and Moderna studies have not looked at that, and the other vaccine trials are not looking at that because it's so expensive and logistically difficult to do those samples every week. And it might well be that it does look as if the Oxford vaccine can protect against asymptomatic transmission. And again, the regulator will know whether that is more in the low dose, high dose than the high dose or not in the process of making their decision. So whatever decision the MHRA make, we can be completely confident that they've been involved in the design of the study and the ongoing work, and they're happy with the safety and the efficacy, and we should be confident that it will be effective with the dose that they recommend. And that is because in all the studies so far, nobody has had any hospitalized or severe cases. So from a personal protection point of view, the vaccine, even if it doesn't stop everybody getting coronavirus, will and should stop everybody getting such severe disease they get to hospital or they die. So, and this vaccine, of course, can be easily administered in existing healthcare systems. It can be stored at fridges. The Moderna vaccine is also refrigerated, but the Pfizer vaccine is -70, as we've been hearing about. It's really important we carry on these clinical trials. We need different vaccines and technologies to ensure a global supply chain. But we are going to need to change the design and recruitment strategies, both in the UK and then globally as vaccines deployed. We've some principles for those of you on the clinical trials. There's some principles that have been agreed by the UK Chief Medical Officers. Firstly, to ensure that nobody's adversely impacted by taking part in a trial, to try and ensure the integrity of the trials, and to encourage people to remain in vaccine trials in order to monitor their safety and immune responses, whether or not they receive an additional dose of deployed vaccine. Now, every study is going to have to be treated differently because they're different technologies and there's a different approach. And each of the companies, the sponsors, are going to have to discuss with the chief investigators, the MHRA, the ethics committees, how the different unblinding options should occur. But the best bottom line is, as you are called and as your turn comes up for a vaccine, if you're on a trial, you'll be able to speak to find out what you received and to choose a deployed vaccine if you're in the placebo group, or decide what to do if you've received 1 or 2 doses of a trial vaccine. And each trial is going to have specific communication with the participants. There's lots of information on the Be Part of Research website that is being updated all the time. Don't bother to try and read this version because it might well have changed by the time you see this video. Now, it's really important too that we think about children and pregnancy when it comes to clinical trials, because at the moment, the children and pregnant women are excluded from the vaccine program. We didn't start these trials early because of uncertainty about this new pediatric multisystem inflammatory disorder and whether antibodies were driving that condition. But we've actually seen no inflammatory disease of any kind in any COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials so far in adults. And so the community do feel it's safe now to start the phase 2 trials of for teenagers, younger children, and in pregnancy. And the Janssen, the Oxford, the Janssen studies currently doing feasibility for sites across the UK for children, young children, teenagers, and pregnancy. We hope to be taking part in all 3 of those studies here in Southampton. The Oxford vaccine group are looking at what protocol will be implemented again in January, and Pfizer are also doing expressions of interest and feasibility work across the UK network. In terms of deployment, we know that we're starting now that NHS is going to be giving vaccine to the elderly and to healthcare workers first, and people in care homes, particularly the very old in care homes. And we know that the Oxford vaccine is under consideration at the moment by the MHRA, and we're expecting a decision either just before or just after Christmas. Due process will happen, and the MHRA will make that decision when they make their decision. We'll come to the priority groups in a minute, but in terms of public confidence, that regulatory process does need to be seen to be done. And I'm not worried that the MHRA have been able to look at Pfizer in one timescale and Oxford in another, because they just have to look at the data that's presented and work out what the right thing to do is. And as I've already explained to you, there are some complexities with looking at the Oxford data that means the MHRA have got to think about what the right thing to do is. From a clinical perspective, most of the public are likely to accept pandemic vaccines to protect themselves and others. People do this every year for flu. And the children's flu immunisation programme is to protect the vulnerable in society. It's to protect the grandparents and the elderly. This has been hugely successful. People don't mind their kids having flu vaccine to protect everybody else. And overall, even the people who are saying, oh, I'm not sure, will see the programme proceeding successfully, and they will then become confident that they're doing the right thing, having a vaccine. In the UK, the Department of Health are really quite good at handling vaccine-related events, or events that happen to people who receive vaccines that are nothing to do with the vaccine. And we saw an example of that in the cervical cancer implementation. The vaccine where on the first days of the program there was a collapse of a teenage girl in a school, which hit the headlines, but actually really quickly it became clear it was not to do with the vaccine, and the media were responsible, and the Department of Health provided the information, and panic was avoided, and the program was successful. In the swine flu epidemic in 2009-10, the H1N1, the pandemics vaccine implemented in the UK, became known as being associated with narcolepsy, an effect that was seen in European cohorts given that vaccine, but not with the same vaccine manufactured in Canada, as it turned out. But that was a good example of why the regulatory process must be explicit and clear and in the public domain, and we need to keep on watching carefully, even people who've received a vaccine. We're not expecting these unusual effects of vaccines, but the systems and processes are there to watch for very, very rare events. There are only 70 cases of narcolepsy identified in the tens of millions of people who received that vaccine. The mainstream media appeared to have handled the allergic events this week really, really sensibly. When we give people new vaccines, some people will be allergic to them, and the people who've been who've had reactions this week have apparently been very vulnerable to allergy. They were carriers of EpiPen, and so that's why we've got a current recommendation not to immunize people with the Pfizer vaccine if they carry an EpiPen, if they've got severe allergy. But this is constantly evolving, and we should be looking to today's up-to-date Department of Health advice and NHS advice at any one time. We really need the media not to focus on hesitancy. The oxygen makes low-level anxieties and overall public hesitancy much worse. And at the scientific community, as healthcare professionals, the NHS and government, we can all help by speaking clearly and with clarity about the trial process, the regulatory process that are in place to license the vaccines and the medicines and ensure safety. And hopefully I've reassured you about that today. Governments globally do have a choice whether to regulate social media misinformation, and they could choose to do that. Wouldn't help WhatsApp, but it might help Twitter and Facebook, but that's a political decision. Other interventions, much more complicated. It's very, very unlikely that compulsory vaccination would be a good thing in the UK. It would more likely be very detrimental to public. Similarly, for healthcare workers, it's very unlikely that anybody would try to make this a compulsory event without huge consultation and workforce support. And nobody at this stage is talking about even beginning those consultations. Unusually, the hospitality industry are actually thinking it might be a good idea, but they need to be careful, because you certainly don't want to have to wait till September for the pubs to be able to welcome everybody back, because it is going to take a long time for most of the population to receive a vaccine in that under 50 previously well group. So how are we going to do deployment? The JCVI, the Joint Committee of Vaccine and Immunisation, have a ranking of prioritisation for people at risk. The current version was the 2nd of December, but it will be updated constantly. And residents in care homes, as I've said already, and their carers, people over 80 and frontline health and social care workers, and then working down the other age groups and people with other underlying health conditions, as is available publicly. It's estimated that together, these groups represent around 99% of preventable deaths from COVID-19. Who's a frontline healthcare worker? All of us. Everybody involved in direct patient care, doctors, dentists, midwives, nurses, but the paramedics, ambulance drivers, pharmacists, optometrists, occupational therapists, physios, radiographers, all the students, people in non-clinical roles, porters, receptionists, ward clerks, cleaners, all the people who work in the laboratories, pathology staff, not just the clinical research teams, but the research teams, the academic laboratory research teams as well. Anybody handling clinical specimens or potentially infected samples, and anybody under the age of 18, so 16 and 17-year-olds who are employed in or studying, training with us in health and social care work. These people should be offered vaccination alongside us all. So we're all eligible as frontline healthcare workers. I won't go through the clinical risk groups for people aged 16 and over. That's all available online. If you Google Public Health England COVID-19 Green Book, that comes up straight away. Now, for pregnant women, this is more complicated because of the rigors of the MHRA approval process. There are very strict rules for new vaccines and products, and currently the MHRA and the JCVI have favoured a precautionary approach, and women are advised not to come forward for vaccination if they may be pregnant. Now, this is why we need to do the pregnant women trials of the new vaccines, and we will be doing these in the UK and in Southampton starting in the new year, because pregnant women are at risk of COVID compared to other women their age, and it's important that we demonstrate safety in pregnancy for all of the vaccines so that these can be deployed, just like pertussis and flu vaccines are given in pregnancy in routine NHS care. Breastfeeding, again, is currently prohibited by the MHRA on the Pfizer data sheet under the emergency regulation. It could be that it's safe to give in pregnancy because theoretically only antibodies should cross into breast milk, but at the moment, due to the way the vaccine's been approved, we can't include people, breastfeeding mothers in the NHS immunisation programme. And for children under 16, the JCVI have offered very clear advice that we should only be immunising children at very high risk of exposure and serious outcomes, such as older children with severe neurodisabilities that require residential care. So maybe in our whole Wessex population, 10 or 20 very severely affected children. We're not expecting this at the moment. We're not expecting to immunise any other children in any other clinical risk group until we've done the children's studies that will start in the new year. So just finally, I'd like to just break a few myths that are floating around social media. The COVID vaccines don't contain gelatin. The vaccines that do contain gelatin are in the public domain. There's a very good government, PHE, Public Health England leaflet explaining which ones contain gelatin, like the nasal flu vaccine. That's again available, very easy to find online. You can have a vaccine if you've got a minor allergy or allergy to eggs that doesn't involve severe anaphylaxis and carrying an EpiPen, but please check national advice for individual vaccines at the time. The restriction on severe allergy is only for the Pfizer vaccine, and all of the other vaccines will have their own recommendations. The vaccines don't use fetal tissue in vaccine manufacture, and just to remind you what I said at the beginning, the RNA vaccines cannot alter our DNA. Their message that just disappears once they've delivered their message to human cells. So which vaccine should you have? Any deployed vaccine has been and will have been fully evaluated by the MHRA. And in my mind, the main uncertainties are not about safety. They're about how long immunity will last, how often the vaccines should be given, how well they'll work in different groups, such as the elderly, immunosuppressed, children, pregnant women, and so on. It's not about safety. There's going to be a media frenzy, and if we, healthcare professionals, hesitate, then so will everyone else. So please take the first vaccine offered to you. I certainly will be. It won't matter whether it's the Pfizer vaccine, the Oxford vaccine, or one of the later vaccines. But what it will do is it will protect me from getting severe COVID, and it might, if we're lucky as a community and a population, it might be that immunising people will actually prevent transmission and carriage. But at this stage, we will have to deploy the vaccines into the community to find out what that effect will be. We've got a hint from the Oxford trial that the Oxford vaccine, or the AstraZeneca one, it's the same thing. The Oxford vaccine will be able to protect some people from asymptomatic carriage, but it won't be until we've deployed the vaccines in the community that we actually know the real effect. And until then, we are going to be committed to wearing masks and social distancing in order to protect the population from the impact of the pandemic. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you found this useful.